Our last speaker is Olivia Armandof, who is a fifth-year PhD candidate in the Department of Art History at the University of Southern California. And this academic year, she is serving as a pre-doctoral dissertation fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. She focuses on the 20th century American art and material culture, and her dissertation titled Volcanic Matter, Land Formation and Artistic Creation examines how Hawaii's volcanoes have animated diverse artistic engagement with land and landscape from the island's pre-contact era to the present. Please join me to welcome Olivia.
Thank you so much, Hua, for that introduction. I want to start by thanking the conference organizers, who are also the conveners of this panel, Hua and Todd. I'm grateful to you for making these 3 days of talks possible and for the opportunity to present my own work and learn from my fellow speakers. All right, let's begin with this dramatic image. What are we looking at? It's an undeniable explosion, and the menacing cloud of smoke might first conjure a war zone. But if I told you that you were witnessing a volcanic eruption, you might understand the scene differently. Indeed, the mushroom-shaped cloud, referred to in contemporaneous reports as a cauliflower column of ash, released by this phreatic eruption, and many others like it, bears a striking resemblance to the historical mushroom clouds that are best known, those that formed after the atomic bombings of World War II. If we look at another image with the context of the first one in mind, you might pick up on the long expanse of lava rock fields, which recede into space, and the gentle rise of the shield volcano known as Mauna Loa. In the distance, we see another plume of smoke wafting into the air, which could easily be attributed to volcanic activity. But your expectations might again be surprised when I identify this as the result of a bombing undertaken by the US military in an attempt to halt a volcanic flow. The tension between natural disasters and human warfare, evident in these two photographs taken 11 years apart, will be my focus today. I argue that the dichotomies that we might expect to have been drawn to differentiate two phenomena, natural disasters and warfare, have not always been clearly defined, especially in the context of the interwar years when these two photographs were taken. For example, we might understand warfare to be avoidable, while natural disasters are inexorably determined by geological circumstances. However, in the conditions following World War I and in anticipation of the US's entrance into the conflict of World War II, a particular mindset about war was evidenced in the news media, where the American declaration of war was frequently treated as an inevitability. In contrast, in an age of technological optimism, many operated under the belief that scientific and industrial innovation could tame nature and subvert such things as natural disasters, suddenly making the preordained preventable. Such attitudes are evident in Thomas Jagger's book, Volcanoes Declare War, which was published at the conclusion of the war in 1945, but which looked back to this interwar period and the actions the author undertook as the director of the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory, including the pictured bombing of Mauna Loa 10 years earlier. His introduction to the book aligns later wartime activity, including the bombings at Pearl Harbor, with the efforts undertaken by volcanologists since the founding of Hawaiian Volcano Observatory in 1911, noting that, quote, Hawaii was the place where the War of the Skyways broke out on December 7, 1941, and where the war against volcanoes had been going on systematically since 1911. Both wars have much in common, demanding services of intelligence, scouting expeditions, mapping, photography, and supply, while the main base is essentially a listening post, with all the resources of science, invention, and industry brought to bear on the detection of the strategy of the enemy. Jagger's reference to the enemy, a volcanic enemy, is later figured in the book through the native Hawaiian or Kanaka Maoli elemental deity of fire and volcanoes, Pele, whose actions are described as militaristic threats. For example, in a radio broadcast in 1934 reporting on recent eruptions, Jagger likened volcanic activity to the use of explosive devices, noting that, quote, every detonation 2 miles away completely announced itself as though Pele were pressing a button. It's worth noting that the equation between volcanic activity and violence is not unique. Long perceived as a threat, volcanoes have historically elicited fear, resulting in similar comparisons. For example, it is evident in militaristic terms for volcanic output. For example, since 1833, masses of partially molten rock that are thrown from erupting volcanic vents have been referred to as volcanic bombs. Objects also tell this story, such as this fragment of lava rock, which encases a spent bullet. In exploring the uniqueness of such an object, I discovered this Reddit thread from last year, authored by someone who might have also wondered whether natural or man-made firepower might triumph if posed against one another in a battle. The bullet in this curiosity resembles two physical traces left by the bombings of Mauna Loa, two sets of unexploded ordnance, one of which is shown at right in a 1977 photograph taken decades after the bombing. These bombs have become embedded as part of the landscape, keeping this historical episode alive today in news reports as recent as 2020. Despite the potentially enduring relevance of an analogy between volcanic activity and violence, I argue that Jagger's words and the unstable divisions between natural disasters and human warfare reflect a larger time of tumult, when changes following the First World War and the instability on the eve of the Second determined a larger questioning of what we might refer to as the laws of nature. My presentation today is drawn from work I'm doing on a dissertation titled Volcanic Matter, Land Formation and Artistic Creation, which examines representations of artistic engagement with Hawaii's volcanic materials. The most well-known artists working at the site of Kilauea volcano, the most active volcano on the island chain, were a group of painters known as the Volcano School, and they cohered around the volcano in the final decades of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th. Coming from afar and representing a range of nationalities, the artists were working in the European landscape tradition. However, I was curious to explore the less well-chronicled history of photography at the site. If we think back to Jagger's earlier quote, you might remember that he lists photography as an essential activity deployed in both the service of warfare and volcanology. Indeed, photography was frequently taken up at Kilauea in the first half of the 20th century with a variety of different aims, from the scientific to the commercial. For example, a prolific quantity of photographs were produced to cater to a growing tourism industry, and most remain unattributed to individual photographers. Things like stereograph cards and postcards abound in collections of ephemera at repositories such as the Library of Congress. However, working in Hawaii, I quickly encountered two photographers whose careers were closely connected with the site, Kanishi Maehara and Tai-Sing Liu. Surviving photographs by both Asian American settlers in the islands capture their overlapping practice by focusing their lenses on natural and man-made explosions in the island chain. In their stories, I was eager to test Jagger's hypothesis and consider the ways their labor, photographing volcanic eruptions, bore a resemblance to the work undertaken by wartime photographers. Compounding the very tangible physical dangers posed by work at locations of natural flux like volcanoes, these two photographers also faced more insidious dangers stemming from racial biases. In order to consider their labor, I'll spend some time today with their career arcs, orienting us chronologically in each of their biographies, then consider the ways the historical conditions in this period of social and political upheaval determined and frustrated their successes. Maehara and Tai-Sing had more in common than not, although their careers came to remarkably different conclusions. They were born 6 years apart, Maehara in Hiroshima in 1880, and he was a first-generation Japanese settler in Hilo, Hawaii, making the journey when he was only 16 years old. Like many Japanese immigrants, upon his arrival, he initially worked on a sugar plantation. After serving the terms of his indenture, he found employment at the local post office in 1901, hired because of his proficiency in both Japanese and English languages, and he continued to work in this capacity for 20 years. But his early interest in photography is evidenced by his solicitation in 1911 in Japan for a spouse who would be willing to help him in his photographic practice. Matsuo Kubo joined him in Hawaii, becoming his wife and his photographic partner, as she took on the labor of hand-coloring his photographs. During this period, Maehara occupied the role of an amateur photographer, but in 1921, upon his retirement from the post office, he had turned his attention to his photographic practice full-time. Mahabhara built upon his success in Hilo at his shop known as the Camera Craft Shop by expanding his operations to Hawaii National Park, also known today as Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. And when this national park issued a call for applications for a park photographer in 1929. As the authorized park photographer, Maehara had a license that allowed him to establish and operate a shop at the center of tourist activity at the national park, proximate to the main source of lodgings, Volcano House, and the primary destination, the rim of Halemaumau crater. Newspaper advertisements and Maehara's business card emphasized this authority, identifying him as the authorized park photographer. And in this image at left, the only known photographic portrait of Maehara, he further links his identity to the park, wearing a lapel pin that reads HNP for Hawaii National Park. But he also identified as a Japanese American. Like in his previous position at the post office, where his Japanese language skills were invaluable, and in his personal life, where he was an influential figure in his community, serving as the president of the local Japanese Association. His Japanese American heritage was an asset in 1929 when he was hired by the Hawaii National Park. His volcano photo studio announced his origins in its design, one imagined by Maehara in the arts and crafts style derived from Japanese architectural precedents. It was described as the first building of its kind to be built in Hawaii, appealing to interest in the exotic, much like the photographs that were sold inside. These photographs included striking images of volcanic activity targeting the tourist market, such as the hand-colored postcard of an eruption at left. But in his official capacity, Maehara was also commissioned by the park and Hawaiian Volcano Observatory to photograph certain volcanic events that would then be featured in the Volcano Letter, the weekly periodical issued by the national park. In this way, his commercial practice was designed to satisfy two audiences, appealing to tourists' taste for the sublime and both amateur and professional volcanologists concerned with scientific accuracy. So we can see in this single image that could be tailored to appeal to both, which is a testament to Maehara's skill as a photographer. Tai-Sing was born in 1886 in Honolulu. A second-generation settler, his parents had both emigrated from China to Honolulu at the end of the 1870s. His father's career as a sign painter would have introduced Tai-Sing to artistic labor, but he initially pursued a career as a salesman. It was only after a visit to Hawaii Island, while taking amateur photographs in the region around Kilauea Volcano, that a friend complimented his eye and encouraged him to pursue a career in it. Returning to Honolulu, Tai-Sing found employment at the Gurney Art Shop between 1909 and 1918. However, his formative experiences photographing the Kilauea region stayed with him, and he returned numerous times over the course of his career to photograph the area, reportedly following the news about volcanic activity, then making the journey to photograph noteworthy changes. This was increasingly possible after 1918, when he transitioned to work for the U.S. Navy in the position that he would hold for the remainder of his career as the official photographer of the Pearl Harbor Naval Base. In this capacity, Tai-Sing assumed a range of different photographic responsibilities, from the portraits of thousands of employees who worked in the Naval Yard for their identification badges to record-keeping of both their official and recreational pursuits, such as Navy excursions taken through the island chain, including to Kilauea Volcano. His primary responsibility was to picture the Naval Yard's facilities and the Pacific Fleet, and in photographs like the one taken in 1919 at left of the battle practice training exercises, we can appreciate his skill at composing an image. Like Maehara, Tai-Sing also balanced the work he did in an official capacity as a photographer employed by the federal government with commercial work. He served as a staff photographer for the Honolulu Star-Bulletin and the tourism periodical Paradise of the Pacific, both of which featured his volcanic scenes, and he frequently completed work for other businesses in the tourism industry, such as the Inner Island Steamship Company, which commissioned him to capture landscapes for advertising booklets. In some ways, we can remark on both Maehara and Tai-Sing's noteworthy success as Asian American photographers, something that separated them from an earlier chapter in the history of photography in the islands. Beginning with the arrival of the first photographer in 1853, only 14 years after the invention of the daguerreotype had been announced in Paris, many of the earliest successful photographic businessmen in Hawaii had come from either Europe or the United States. It was only at the start of the 20th century that this history became less white. The change came with broader shifts in the demographic makeup in the region. As the island chain's economy concentrated on agricultural work in the second half of the 19th century, laborers were sought abroad, and in addition to Chinese and Japanese immigrants, waves of settlers from Portugal, Puerto Rico, Korea, and the Philippines contributed to this diversity. While Chinese laborers marked the first wave of immigration, and we've heard a little bit about the history of Chinese immigration to the United States, the Kingdom of Hawaii adopted the precedent of the United States' Chinese Exclusion Act 1 year later in 1883. After that point, Japanese immigrants were favored until 1907, when U.S. restrictions were imposed on Japanese immigration, and in 1924, when the Japanese Exclusion Act brought the period to an end. But in that time, between 1868 and 1924, the over 200,000 immigrants from Japan who arrived in Hawaii remained, so that by 1920, over 40% of the island chain was of Japanese heritage. As the Asian American population in Hawaii increased, there was some movement away from agricultural labor and toward many other industries, including photography. So in addition to Maehara and Tai Sing, the Chinese American settler Ong Kar was also working as a photographer in Hawaii in the first decades of the 20th century. At the same time, Maehara and Tai Sing's labor could also reflect certain challenges they faced. While most other photographers in Hawaii worked on commission, both Maehara and Tai Sing built their success through their official roles, ones that seemingly promised greater stability of employment. Their successes photographing volcanic subjects were also determined in part by the era in which they were working. During the first half of the 20th century, Kilauea volcano was particularly active. Furthermore, with the establishment of the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory in 1911, the first facility of its kind, initiatives to better understand geological sciences were frequently pictured in the world publications through the example of Kilauea. Returning to the image I began this talk with, the photograph Maehara took of the 1824 phreatic eruption, alongside an image taken only 4 days later of the same subject by Tai Sing, we can get an idea of how unique this period was. While Kilauea's eruptions are typically effusive eruptions, in which magma reached the surface, then flowed easily downhill, building up along the gently rising slopes that form the shield volcano, it is believed that 1% of the prehistorical and historical eruptions at Kilauea over the course of 280,000 years have been explosive. One of these rare eruptions, the phreatic eruption pictured, occurred in 1924, when the buildup of steam resulted in an explosive eruption that lasted 17 days and resulted in a man's death when massive blocks were hurled through the air. Photographs of such blocks, like one of the 12-ton boulder taken by Tai Sing at Wright, frequently included human figures as representations of scale. Tai Sing himself is pictured with his camera before a different 8 to 10 ton block at left. While his wide grin is playful, it belies the danger of the moment and the tragedy of the death that occurred only 4 days prior. While not the backbreaking labor that the majority of Asian immigrants to Hawaii would have experienced in this period while working on sugar plantations, photographic work in such an unpredictable environment came with certain risks. In this way, it closely resembled the work of wartime photographers as Jagger proposed. Other photographs of Tai Sing, taken while working at the volcano, reveal this vulnerability, such as these two self-portraits that show him poised at the rim of Halemaumau crater, perched precariously above a vast pool of molten lava below. When one of the largest volcanoes on the island, Mauna Loa, erupted in 1935, it is conceivable how the deadly nature of the 1924 eruption was still part of the popular imaginary. In response, Jagger and the US military conceived of a plan to bomb the flow in an attempt to halt its progress, something I've already previewed for you. As the authorized park photographer, Maehara chronicled this project, including the arrival of bombers from Honolulu and the actual bombing of the site. Jagger described the bombing as, quote, an intellectual and practical victory over nature. As these words make clear, it was not only rooted in his desire to subvert future disasters, but it was also an attempt to assert human dominance over the volcano. But while it was framed as, quote, an excellent peacetime initiative, as the general in charge of the bombardment reflected, it served as a valuable technical training. In its close connections to warfare, it foreshadowed the greater loss of life that already loomed on the horizon, the most well-known bombing of the Hawaiian landscape, which occurred 6 years later at Pearl Harbor. Like Maehara, who had been like Maehara had been commissioned to photograph the 1935 bombing, Taising assumed official duties on December 7, 1941, which he chronicled over 20 years later in an essay published by the United States Naval Institute Proceedings. In these published recollections, he described aiding and putting out fires, then working to procure food for troops who had not eaten as they worked to respond to the disaster, responsibilities he assumed instead of his photographic ones, which he only turned to in the aftermath of the event. Taising's reminiscences also include his frequent references to his identity as a Chinese man. He describes his fear of being mistaken for a Japanese enemy and the lengths he went to identify himself as Chinese. He concludes his reflection by quoting Confucius, further enforcing his heritage. In this moment, in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor, the intertwined fates of Maehara and Taising diverge. And while Taising understood his Chinese identity to have been his salvation, Maehara's Japanese background was his undoing. In January of 1942, a month after Pearl Harbor, the emblematic mark of Maehara's Japanese-American identity, his photo studio, was referred to as an eyesore and an ill wind by the park superintendent Edward Wingate as he described plans to tear the structure down. Maehara himself met a similar silencing. Like other Japanese-American leaders in the Japanese-American community in Hawaii, he was perceived as a security threat, and he was interned in New Mexico. While there, a portrait of Maehara by George Hoshida continued to identify him through his association with Hawaii National Park. But with the end of the war, Maehara was not permitted to return to his role as park photographer. In Maehara and Taising's photographs of the volcano and their photographs of military activity, I believe we can find a potent metaphor. The changeable environments both pictured parallel the volatility and danger they experienced during their lives as photographers as they navigated the challenging political implications of their work in the interwar years. And Maehara and Taising's very human stories of loss and triumph near the vicissitudes of each eruption and each battle they turned their lenses toward. Thank you.